Sounds like a yes then. Cool. Planned weekly meeting, 19th of January 2022. Gabe?
Yep. Just an FYI, I've shifted my core working hours to 6:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So it shouldn't impact much, but I will be around earlier for some of the folks who are around later.
I read the article, and this is because you want to be more like the people of Luxembourg, if I believe correctly.
Just trying to be more efficient, more focused and less noise. So I found that when I start at 6:30, I'm actually able to dig into some of the bigger things earlier on before some of the folks in the US wake up. So it also enables me to spend a couple more hours of daylight with my kids in the afternoon, which is win-win.
You're going to experience European time. So yeah, it's pretty good. Cool. Donald?
No, we can skip mine. I was just going to applaud Gabe for getting up that early and say that I love the early shift. So
you guys can have it.
Welcome aboard. Cool. I'll jump into confidential notes. So there are a few issues on at the minute on the product planning side of the team that I'm keeping an eye on, and one of them is confidential notes. These are either issues that have been started and taken forward by a community contributor or started by us in the past and continued up to a point. Confidential notes is an interesting one because the way it's implemented currently, it's not ready for general availability because we can't be absolutely sure that confidentiality is respected in all circumstances. So you won't see confidential notes in the UI, and I believe we've removed them from activity feeds, but we haven't checked things like RSS feeds, email notifications, maybe different parts of the API, I don't know. So we need to harden it first. The problem is we kind of need to define an MVC that we've already kind of had community contributors push forward into what would be a second iteration. And so what I wanted to do in this call was to try and, for everyone on the call, like who's interested in this, like try and come up with an MVC. I've proposed one. It seems to me to be logical. One of the main problems we're having with this is that you can already, like it's behind a feature flag, but you can already go into the API and convert a note to be confidential. And that is not behind a feature flag. So that's kind of worrying because you can do it on any note, including like MR diff notes, which doesn't really have a use case as far as I know and opens all this complexity. So what I'm suggesting is that we devise an MVC epic, stuff everything that's not in the MVC into another feature flag for the future, or even remove it entirely from the code base. And that the MVC should be pretty simple. And I think that means like you can create a private note as the root of a discussion, which then the rest of the discussion is private by default, and you can't toggle it to public ever, and that it's restricted to epics and issues. So yeah, any thoughts on that as an MVC, first of all?
I think it's great. I also just going to highlight that Zendesk does not allow me, at least to my knowledge, to change the confidentiality of my notes. They also call it an internal note, which I think more clearly communicates what it means actually, but just another data point.
Yeah, Eugenia, you have something there as well.
Yeah, I was just saying maybe something very specific about the type of notes, if we should limit that. If we just want a discussion note, maybe by checking the type of note when we create it, not allow it to be confidential if it's not a discussion note.
Yeah, I actually think that, yeah, we shouldn't. There's no, there was a community contribution to try to bring in toggleability, and it got stuck in the weeds, and the community contributors quit on it because as far as I understand, there's no object in the database currently to describe a discussion. That's just a relationship between a root comment and replies to that note. So I think that when you talk about toggleability, it raises all these questions. What if I what if I have the first comment in a discussion and I toggle the discussion to be public, then all of your replies, should they also become public? Because that feels weird. Alternatively, like maybe it goes note by note, but that's cumbersome because then if I have 10 replies in the discussion, I also have to make them public. So it raises all these questions that I don't think we should really be solving in an MVC. I think we should just do the simplest thing and make it possible to have a private note. And if you really want to make that information public, you can copy it all into a public note later for guests and non-members to see.
That's what I think too, John. Just maybe have like a notification like, hey, this is private. Like if you want to make it public, just start a new thread. Sorry.
No need to apologize. Yeah, I think that's it's to me like it's also the simplest thing to do. We might never need toggleability. You know, people might never ask for it. Anyway, you might get 90% of it, and it just brings in so much complexity that we don't really want to be solving up front. We've already, like I said, had 2 community contributors who really wanted to see the feature released who just quit on the MR because it was too complicated. Did that, I don't know if I answered your question though, Eugenie. Yeah, I think it should be limited to discussion notes only. Like I don't think we would want to make system notes, for example, or MR diff notes. I think we should just avoid MRs altogether in the first iteration, focus on issues and epics.
It's also, like I said there, the image diff note, so that when you go and comment in an image, not by UI, but you can go to the API and create that type of note and make it confidential. It doesn't really show us confidential because it doesn't have the ability, but it's just like the confidential is in every note, any type, even in commits, snippets, everything.
John, you don't think we could push this to the issuable level and just get it for merge requests as well, the main notes? Or
the problem is that like then we've run into already, I think, this thing where we have to maintain it then for merge requests, you know, or somebody has to maintain it, and it's like you then have to look at like MR diff notes, right, and kind of say like, well, think of all the special cases that those notes have, right? Or maybe not, I don't know. Like, so maybe on MRs you could have discussion notes be confidential as well, but only discussions and replies. I don't know enough about the code, but
We could also, in that line, I had under point D. So I think notes right now are resolvable, but there's no UI for it on issues. We could do a similar type thing where we don't overthink it too much, but we like don't add explicit support for it in the UI. So if you look at a note, it can already be marked as resolvable on an issue, I think, technically, but it's not like a formally supported thing. That could be a viable workaround too.
you mean use that philosophy for the MRs?
Yep.
Yeah, unfortunately we keep fragmenting things. You know, issues can do kind of one thing and MRs not, and then back again, and I kind of just hate to see us keep doing that.
Yeah,
my
and from
concern.
the front end,
When they shouldn't be different. Yeah.
Yeah, to just expand on your point, Brett, on the front end, I believe the diff code is pretty coupled between like at the issuables level. So it might actually be more difficult to separate them out and not do it on MRs if we were going to do it on the issue side of things. So if we can get, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, like if we can get the UI and if we can get agreement from is it the MR team from source code or editor source code, I think that at least from the front end would be an easier path forward.
is there a difference between notes on MRs and note type like diff note? Like, so if we said all notes of type, I don't know what the type is, but comment or written note. Then we could do it on all issuables, right? But just exclude diff notes and all that kind of thing.
That's what I was thinking, but I don't know the answer you asked either. We know that something's a system note, but I'm not sure the difference between a diff note at the moment.
Right, cool. Well, thanks, Brett. Actually, so that's the next thing we should probably look at is like if we're going to try to create an MVC out of it, we can nail that down, and also we've got to figure out what we're going to do with the API. We've already had this open for a while where people can create confidential notes, but we've not guaranteed that that actually has any meaning. Like if they are creating confidential notes or updating notes to be confidential, we've never sat down and said, what should that actually look like? Like if the notes are replied to something else, does it just not appear in the discussion or what? Like I presume it doesn't. So, but I think if we could solve those two things, then we have the MVC and we just actually have to seal up all the exits so that we're not sharing the note anywhere through email or RSS or something.
Just quickly, I think there is discussion note, which I think is like the written, I think that's it inherits note.
Cool. So limited to discussion notes on any issuable.
Regarding this private notes, I think that MVC sounds like a great idea. I was wondering if what happens if some external user, or not external but unprivileged user, is pinged in my comment, but Eugenia already answered my question, so thanks. And I was wondering if we could somehow get rid of edge cases like to-dos or notifications if we would just, for example, ignore these users in a first MVC. So we would just say, okay, so unprivileged users are ignored from any notifications or something like that.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Like, but what do we do? Just not. We'd need to do that in Banzai, right? Like in the user reference filter or something. Like detect that they don't have access and not convert the thing to a, I don't know what you call that, like a node or a user tag.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's done in the bonds. I mean, we do the redaction there, but in general, if you mention somebody on a confidential issue, they don't necessarily get pinged, right? If they're not part of they're from the community or whatever. There's some logic in there somewhere for doing that already, I would think. So maybe we can tap into that.
Yeah, good. Okay, cool. I've linked the epic or issue there already. So if you want to take a look, anyone who's contributed here as well, like if you want to go in and put your ideas in there for the MVC, like ideally there's then like 3 things to do, which is to, sort out the API. We still need to figure out like have any confidential, have any notes been converted to private when they shouldn't have been through the API. And then I would recommend just put that behind a feature flag defaulted to off. And then in the future, if we want to iterate on this, we use that feature flag. Cool. Donald, you have the next thing if there's no more comments on that.
Cool. Do y'all know what time? Like, I wonder if Melissa wants to be involved in this conversation, though. I know she said she's going to be a little late. Does anyone know how late she's going to be? Yeah. All right. We'll just continue with it. So, work items. Okay, so there's a conversation, a long thread in the plan backend channel around kind of the level of flexibility we want to allow on work item types. Do y'all want to just jump into the conversation on it, or I talked to Natalia a little bit, and she has a demo ready of her of her branch, and it may be helpful to have that as kind of the baseline for the conversation. Why don't we do that? Actually, Natalia, would you mind doing
Yeah,
that
I
demo
can
real quick?
I can totally run a demo. Please be ready to the fact that this is a local mutation. It's not calling any kind of backend stuff, and it's not selecting a work item type. So we are following the old design where we will creating a task, but maybe it would be nice to kickstart the conversation about the selection of work item type. So let me share my screen quickly. So currently we have this flow. Hopefully my GDK is not freezing right now. Whenever work item feature flag is enabled, we will have this little button. Clicking on it will give us a popover with convert to work item. And here is where the problem starts. Currently, whatever we are doing here, when we click create work item, it just changes locally the DOM. But we would need to send the mutation to the backend here. And as it was discussed in Slack, we cannot send the mutation to create a task or any kind of predefined type here. We would need to have a dropdown, and I have already seen how they updated the designs for it. Does it mean, again, I will just bring the points from the discussion from Slack. Does it mean that we can create any type of work item here, basically letting users select from the dropdown? Do we want to have this dropdown in the model or in the popover? And in general, like, what do we expect to have here whenever user clicks on this link, like opening a generic work item? Because it's quite important to understand how we want to display things on the work item view in the model or in the separate route, what will define them, and so on and so on. So for now, the level of flexibility is very high from what I understand the discussion is like, but I would be happy to hear Gabe's opinion on this.
I think given wanting to maintain flexibility for the long run, I think that's an important principle. And I kind of highlight that down below, just like it will allow us to extend the work item to support more jobs to be done in adjacent, like basically personas, like tickets and opportunities and incidents and so on. I think users should be able to create any type of work item where the type selector lives, I think is a UX decision. Honestly, I think if there's a way that we can allow them to click the convert to work item button and default to a basically child for premium, once we sort of, the product planning team has done some of that work, that's something that we could do sort of when we open up the modals query, the kind of hierarchy or the relationship structure, and then default to one that is below the current type. That's sort of my like 2 cents on that, but I think going into my few thoughts, we want it to work by default, and pre I guess determined to me just looks is like a template basically of your relationships. But we want to keep them generic enough so that users can modify that and or select a different kind of template. Like if they're using one planning methodology where you have the named hierarchy of this, or they have a custom one that maps their business domain. Really, like what it is having somewhere where you define the relationships between your types, and then we launch with a couple different default templates or planning hierarchies, which is just a relationship mapping, and that will give us the latitude to kind of use the same primitives, but to present and package some of the work item features and the hierarchies and relationships into different methodologies. I think anything that is specific to like jobs to be done, whether it's like linking a requirement to a test case or to an actual test that runs the code, like extract that into its own standalone sort of like app that can be enabled for work items. We can certainly shape our own default like hierarchy, and I think we should, so it works by default, but always thinking through the lens of not hard coding some of the stuff would be ideal. I wrote a bunch more, but that's my TLDR.
I see there is a question from Alexis. Alexis, would you like to voice it?
Yeah, no, you're just asking, can users create, any type of work item? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, like the pros and cons of that.
In my opinion, pros, flexibility, obviously cons. I heard that we can define the list of work item types that is specific to the workspace, right? if I understand correctly. So if in one workspace I see the work item type that is called task, probably the user will have any kind of expectation about this type when switching to a different workspace, where it's the same work item type named task, but this is completely different type. I understand this flexibility is important, but I'm afraid this can cause confusion if this type is not having at least some predefined features. So
one of the things I had mentioned in the thread and that we've talked about in the past is, each work item type has a set of abilities, whether it's supports children or supports the time estimate and all these different things. And I always thought, at least in terms of when we were creating tasks, that there was something that we marked as this work item is taskable. It is a task. I don't know how we treat that differently or what behavior that means, but I assume that because we were making it a task, there was some special behavior to it. And if we do that, then you can request any work items that have that flag, and those are the ones that can be presented and carried over to other workspaces or whatever. So that would be not based on the name, but based on a flag that we say, yes, this supports task functions, whether that's how they get listed out or whatever. So that was my thinking on that.
Donald?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how this would work around around creation. So like for tasks, we go to create a task, it shows up with the modal, and then we offer a drop down where they choose the work item type. And do we not show any fields or any widgets until they select the work item type? And then at that point, how do we know what to show how do we know what widgets to show the users?
My thinking was, if we look at the designs that the product planning group has already done for the hierarchy, right? Like you sort of have a set of types and you want to be able to store the type names and edit the type names. And it's sort of also like the same need arises with customizing the names. And the way that I was thinking about it is that each work item gets a schema that we store, right? The schema defines the apps or the fields or the widgets or whatever that exist on it, as well as the relationships. And so that way, like we know what the schema is for a given, like what fields are available on a given work item type. The other kind of example that it has happened recently is we've gotten lots of feedback on incidents that some teams have switched back to using issues because incidents don't have the iteration field on them, and whereas other teams don't want the iteration field on them because they're using incidents as true firefighting things, does not follow on like stuff you're going to schedule into a time box. And so I don't know, that's just, I think Kristen has a lot of good examples that she's done, and Alexis too. So I defer to them and speaking more to that because that's where they've been living. So if they want to jump in here, I encourage them to do so.
I think Alexis has thought through a lot of these scenarios. I'm sure Holly did as well. I think where it gets a little gray is just that when we started to do tasks, we took it off of features. And so now this UI is kind of necessary to support tasks. So there's some overlap. But I think we should be looking at comps designs as we're talking through these things as well. And looking at the front end work that's already been done for to-dos, for tasks. And just figuring out what's the minimum we can do to support the flexibility, as well as having a flow that's consistent so that it will work for epics, it will work for tasks. And I think we're all on the same page as that. We just need to align around the actual designs and even maybe a clickable mockup or something to see how it feels.
There is a prototype that I put into the agenda there. And it's just currently showing the drop down. Let me share my screen. But I haven't seen what Alexis is working on, so it could be that what I've designed here would need to change. Can you all see my screen? It should just be Figma. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Excellent. So in this case, just as Natalia was showing, the 3-dot menu to the side, click on it, gives you the convert to work item prompt. Oh no, did it just lock up? There we go. And in this case, I included the type task. It defaults to task, but there is a type selector where someone can go in and change it if they choose to. Donald makes a good point though, that the fields that are listed below it probably would change dependent upon the type. And I only included these here as they are part of the longer term vision. They're not in VC, the assignees and weight. But that's what you're referring to, correct, Donald? Like if we change this to incident, the fields that are listed below it would then change potentially to reflect whatever's on incident.
Yep,
I don't know if
exactly.
that's helpful to the discussion, what I've shown here. Is there something else that I can expand on, or do we need to shift to see the sort of hierarchical approach that product planning is taking?
Just so I'm clear, if someone is on their free plan and they do this, these are all related tasks. They aren't children, right?
Correct. So if I hit create task, it populates down here as a relates to type of field.
Is there a way to just for the MVC box that to be just tasks and not have the ability to select something that might need to be parented? I'm just thinking out loud.
I think you're right. I think we can box this for the MVC as long as what is determined to be a task comes from the back end, not from the name of the type. So in other words, we know where the vision is and the flexibility we need. And in order to do that, the back end needs to be able to say this type is a task and keep it boxed to that right now. And then we can open it up later, I think. But I wouldn't want to see us hard code anything on the front end for that, if that makes sense.
Right. Do you think that should be like some sort of capabilities like thing that can expand to cover, additional, like if we can put a taskable Boolean on the model and just have it be like, is this work item type taskable? But is your opinion is that like we have some sort of like broader capabilities like indicator?
Yeah, we know that we need this list of abilities / widgets / apps or whatever. That's where this is building to. And if we just now have an abilities that can only hold a flag that says it's taskable, then we can do that, and then we can expand it on the back end later, and then in the UI to start filling this out. But I don't think we have to go with creating many different work items if we're not ready to.
Would it be helpful if Alexis showed her, because I don't know if everyone in project management has seen it, the hierarchy stuff, and Chris and Alexis can talk through it, because I think that could be a good place where we start to get some of that information, right? Without having the front end to have to pass it all the way through. I don't know if y'all want to, but it'd be cool.
I think that would be good to have a session where we just go through that, because Alexis has done tons of work on that, on her ideation and how it would look. Another question that comes to mind just from seeing that mock-up, task has a specific label it's getting in the UI after you've converted it. That flow indicates that task would be a set GitLab work item type that you wouldn't mess with or change if it needs to get special treatment. If I could convert any one of those checkboxes to whatever other work item I have, an epic, an issue, an incident, and they all get the exact same UI where there's a label that goes in on them after I'm done converting and it's all consistent, that's something also, I'm not sure if we're thinking about it that way, but there are some types like task requirements, incidents we may want to lock in, and we have in our docs, and they're true features that people would not be able to turn on and off. I'm not sure if we're saying tasks would be that way or if it would just every item would do that, but it opens a can of worms, like when you can convert to anything from anywhere.
But if we, in other words, it doesn't really matter what the name is necessarily. It's if a customer has said, I want something, this task to be called, you know, a list item or whatever it is, we should be able to handle that, particularly as long as we have on the back end stored that this is a task, that this behaves like a task. So it doesn't have to be locked in as a task. It allows the customer to freely define their methodology. And
it could scale for sure. So like if it works for epics and features and everything else and requirements, that I haven't seen that. Like, I know I get the task thing of moving checkboxes to be subs of an issue. I just think that needs to be thought through holistically with all the work item types too, and just make sure that it makes sense.
Yeah, with that one in particular, the name task is just pulling the type name, but really what we're storing there is the ID of the work item type itself. So that way it could be like any work item types that we have, whether it's ones that we ship by default or that the customer or user adds or specifies or edits or whatever. Like if you change the name of task to foo, right, then it would just show up as foo in that little indicator. So it's sort of like, instead of thinking about it as a special, we're just rendering the type name there for context for the user, if that makes sense. Because we did add the work item types table, I think, right, which specifies like the different types. So we already are storing the ID and then the name, which is separate. And that's why we moved away from enum, I believe, so that we had that flexibility.
It just, that gets into, if they're renaming some of those core ones, it gets tricky when we want to have simplified hierarchy template models that mirror having like epics, stories, issues, and things like that. But yeah, as long as the model's flexible enough to handle everything, I think it can work. It's just, we should probably have more communication around what the actual use cases are for it and how that maps up to the templates, and then to tiering, because obviously tiering is going to play into whether you can even have a child.
Could you have like, maybe I'm confusing this, but the task list is a list of tasks that need to be done to deliver an issue, but like 3 of them could be task objects. Another one could be, you could imagine they would have a work item to complete a design doc or a work item to complete a quality feature spec. So in order to deliver this issue, first we must complete the design doc, complete the feature spec, and then 3 tasks. Is that what we're saying? Like, so it's a task list, but it contains all sorts of different work items.
Currently, outcomes in GitLab are whether you close the issue, and that's what rolls up to epics. So we also have a concept of checklist counts that rolls up onto issues, like 10 out of 30 checkboxes are done. This would be another one, which is, we have checklists, then this would be a count of children. But I think the open closing is the simplest that we need to follow. And it would get weird mixing objects if they didn't have the checkbox in their definition. Technically, I guess it would, all of it's possible. It's just whether that might get confusing if some of them have checkboxes on and the exposed and the others don't.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Which checkboxes are you talking about being exposed?
Like, maybe I haven't seen the updated, but I was thinking that checkboxes were like a title and a checkbox, but maybe they are truly closed, open closed.
Oh, I see what you mean. So maybe I probably wasn't clear. Like I'm just working off what I've seen there in the designs. So you can convert something from that's part of a check. Let's call it a checklist because that's less confusing. So a checklist that has the, you know, the classic like checkbox and then a title. So you can convert that to a work item and you choose the work item type. So let's say we have a checklist with 5 items. First one's write an architecture document. Second one's write a feature spec. Third one's, you know, do some programming. Fourth one's do some more programming, like whatever. So the first 2, let's say they have their own work item types. Well, when you convert them as part of the checklist to a work item, you could say, well, I don't want that to be a task. I want it to be a design document. And the next one, I don't want it to be a task. I want it to be a feature spec request. And then for the next 3 will be just tasks. And they'll all still be in the checklist, right? And they can be open and closed, I presume, with the check box. But I suppose what I'm asking is, can I define a work item type, define it as taskable, and add it to this checklist? Is that ultimately where we want to go in the end?
And you're saying by taskable, we would have a separate outcome, which is completion or something off that taskable object?
Not necessarily, but
Along
like
with completion by weight, open, close, taskable count, GFM or GitLab flavored markdown count. There are 4 ways to track whether something's done.
more that like they would just sort of act the same way. So if you have closed 3 of them, you're 3 out of 5 done with that checklist. You know what I mean? It just happens that the first 3 are different types, you know.
I think we're wanting to keep the completion of the checklist in Markdown completely separate from the behavior of the work item once it's converted. So like, for example, a design document, you wouldn't close that. It would stay open probably, right? Because it's long lived. And also Brett brought up a lot of good points about like, if you go edit things later, you can like basically remove the reference, you can add the reference, and it's like would be sort of impossible to like try to figure out how to sync the state of the work item to the GitLab flavored markdown state. So like simplest MVC, just ignore the fact like once something's done, you can check the box if you want, right? It's sort of a separate type thing, if that makes sense. But yes, that is the design goal, John, so that you can have a list of different things in a checklist, right? Like let's say I'm working on an epic eventually, and I want to convert that into a child thing, and the child thing in the hierarchy is a user story, right? When I convert it to that, I want to specify this as user story, which is a different type. And I think that's where thinking a little bit as generically as we can right now would suit us the best. But
so that sort of answers my question then, yeah. So I think we got there in the end. So the checklist.
I agree on decoupling too. Yeah, decoupling from the markdown.
Summarize the discussion. Should we go with the attributes like Brett proposes? Because this idea, I really like this idea. It's really easy to implement on the front end as well as the back end, because we can simply filter work item types by the attribute, like passing taskable. And it's nicely scalable because we can define in the future, not only taskable, but more like different attributes where we want to partly define the behavior of the work item. So should we go forward with this?
Sure, but I don't know if taskable is the right one because I'm not sure what that defines. I think we talked about that in Slack. The thing that we're defining really is that we're creating a related work item if you're in free, or if you're in premium, you're creating a child. So the thing that I would say is like the attribute to define is on the relationships and less on the fact that it's a task, if that makes sense. And we haven't built out the child stuff yet. So that's why for the MVC, we're going with just related. And however the backend wants to define the relationship thing, then it makes it flexible to work for product planning whenever they get there.
I suppose for now we could have a bit in there that indicates it's taskable in terms of the front end for now. And I don't know if the taskable property means how certain things get rolled up from whatever work item is created. I'm not sure, but at the very least we could attach that to our default task item that we create and allow the UI to use that, and then the backend can return a bunch of stuff later if we need to. I think we can expand that. if we need to. I'm just thinking about the MVC, so I don't want to throw a whole bunch of work under the covers to get this forward.
Forgive me if this is a silly question, but is there a reason why it can't just be promoted to just like a very bare MVC of like whatever the task is, or even just convert it to an issue and then the user could decide what they want to do, if they want to promote it or change it to something else for MVC?
I think that might be reasonable. And that's kind of what I was saying. We would push up a single type of task, and that would be defined on a single work item. And then, yeah, they could, I suppose, edit the work item and change its type if they really needed to, as an initial MVC. I don't think that's the direction we want to finally go, but yeah, something to move forward.
Yeah, because I guess in other products, something I see often is just you're kind of promoting this small checklist into like the smallest work item, right? And then from there, you can keep promoting or editing. I don't know if that's really the way we want to go, but maybe for MVC, it's like you're just promoting it to the next level up for now, and then editing from there, if that makes sense, which I guess at the moment would be an issue because do we have a task work item defined?
No, and I think the promotion is going to go away once you can just switch types, like with incidents and things like that. You just change the type, and then depending on what type you are currently and the hierarchy rules, however product planning would want to do that, I would assume that it would tell you what types you can convert it to, right? And so I think that is a fine thing. It's the same idea of just clicking on the thing and then selecting the type from the drop down, right? When you're actually creating the work item.
I think the thing to remember though is that if we expose this and people start using it, right, with creating issues, and that's not what we want them to do long term, we're sort of guiding them on this path, and then we have to guide them back to whatever it is that we do want them to do long term.
If we allow changing type later, we don't expect to anyhow update the original markdown list in the task list, are we?
No, we're keeping those separate. So the markdown list will have some additional information added to it that links to the new work item or issue or whatever, but there won't be a relationship link between the two.
So we expect that all work items will use the same referencing prefix, like issue, I mean a hash, right? Because, for example, epics use the ampersand, and if you would use a different referencing approach, you couldn't easily change the type, because then you couldn't promote issue to epic, for example, because then it would change the reference in the original markdown and it would be broken, right?
That's where maybe we need to start moving to our generic referencing model for these particular ones. So it needs to be the bracket work item : ID that we use for.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the
vulnerabilities
plan
and stuff.
is to use the unified referencing system for work items, because I think we didn't discuss this yet, but probably we should clarify this.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I'm a little clear on one thing, that when we're creating a task, what are we actually creating? Are we expecting to create it's a work item, which really is an issue under the covers, right? And that was kind of right. It's an issue basically.
Yep.
It's an issue that's has a related link to the issue it's created from.
It's already related, yeah.
That's it. It's really, that's the special attribute, is converting it to an issue or a work item. Then it has a type task, right? And the special attribute or thing that's special about it is that when you create it, you want to be able to specify that it's related if it's in free, and then eventually a child if it's in premium. It's going to be the same thing whenever we have I don't know, Kristen, if you want to talk about like, or Alexis, the related widgets, and how, like, if you have any plans for how we're going to kind of combine the linked issues as well as the parent child type stuff. It's the same problem in that space, I think.
What is the same problem that you're
Well, just
describing?
like, that's the special behavior that we're trying to define right now when we create a new work item, is like the relationship, right? And then depending on what relationship you're trying to define and what tier you're in, defines which types you can create as a linked thing or as a child or a parent work item. That makes sense.
I'd explored the idea of like to-dos as well, like, which would be weird at GitLab maybe, but like almost like to complete widget, right? Which I almost think this could be, like these things that you need to complete in order to complete this issue, I suppose, since you're creating tasks. So it could be something like that. Or these are almost like blocking, but yeah, that's something to explore. And then we would really need to be like strict about the different tiers, as you mentioned, and like how that impacts things, because just because they're on a lower tier doesn't mean this would like stop making sense. So we'd have to look into that. Kristen, what are you thinking about this? Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's the tiering and the parenting that we have to think through still and discuss. I just noticed too in our docs, we do have it, it says it's in our docs already, tasks as of 14.5. Is that something I can test? Is that, sorry, I don't know if I missed the boat on this, but like here, tasks are in, and we're already saying even the URLs, they're behind a feature flag of work items.
I think that's just the task work item type. It's
saying group name,
disabled feature
project
flag.
name, work item 1. Is this locked down and decided?
Well, the URL type, I think, is locked down, but I believe I'd have to go look at the code again. I believe we do create a default task type at the top level. It's one of our system defaults that we ship. But I think it's probably, I think it's not shown until that feature flag is on, but I'd have to go look at it again.
Because I'm curious too, if the URL is one thing that once that's locked down, that will help visualize in terms of like, if you edit the name of task to be something else. I think we decided work items is going to stay locked, and then it's just the ID, right? So it doesn't matter what they call it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And that would make sense, Kristen, like as we were talking about, like if the work item is just a work item with a template applied to it, right? It's still just a work item.
Yes.
And then the user would be customizing templates versus work items themselves, which I think could kind of simplify some things in UI.
Yeah. And
Well,
some of them, like requirements, you wouldn't let them mess with if it's something that's got really baked in functionality, but the others, yes.
Well, Gabe, correct me if I'm wrong. I think requirements and these things, those were again going to be capabilities of a work item. So I could create a new work item and add the requirement capability to it, or the incident capability, or the child capability and stuff like that. We're gonna, you know what I mean?
Yes, those are all capabilities. And that's what sort of enables you to easily have defaults for like different behaviors or different work items, as well as extend them if you want to extend them later. By like, let's say I want to have the ability to link a work item to a code level test, and I want to call it not a requirement, but I want to have that capability on a bug or on something like that, right? So that way, if there's a bug, I can link it in and see that every time that the test run, that the test that solves the bug or prevent it from regressing or still passing. I mean, there's like lots of things, and I think that's where encapsulating them in these like what I call apps, right? That can work on any work item is sort of the flexibility that we're looking for, because then each team can build apps instead of worrying about duplicating everything that's happening on the work item. All right, so if incidents wants to build something specific, or monitor wants to build something specific for incidents, they build a little app that can be enabled for a specific type of work item, and then it can be disabled if other teams don't want to use that feature, right? I think that's the long-term goal, and it sort of decouples the special logic and encapsulates the special behaviors into these like kind of more self-contained apps that people can build, contribute, manage, maintain, that sort of thing.
We are at
Can we
time.
enable that feature flag that says in the docs for work items on our plan instance? Or
Yeah, we can do that. There's nothing. I think the only thing you'll get is the ability to create a task via the issue, or I don't think you'll get any actual functionality from that right now. It's just that the
Okay.
tasks.
it's that the type exists.
Yeah, I'm not sure of that, but I think there's no like nothing that ties into that right now.
If this work items feature flag, we will also have an additional route available with work items, and it also only has basically a mock of the backend capability. So I wouldn't enable it, well, anywhere public, maybe on staging.
So we have a whole nother meeting's worth of content on the agenda. Do we want to try to that topic that's under that's next that we need to take private, but we should discuss that at some point. I don't know how we want to handle that.
Let's you want to seed another doc from this maybe and create a meeting especially to talk about this instead for anyone who's interested. I would recommend probably at least DMs and PMs attend, like, because we'll probably have to figure out what we're going to spend the next quarter on, and I think it would be a good idea probably to do that together. But everybody's welcome, of course. What do you think? Or do we bump it to next week? It feels like another week like means that we're starting the quarter already nearly then without this sorted out. So yeah, any thoughts?
I have to meet with the stakeholders tomorrow afternoon, and they're expecting some update in some form or fashion, which I can wing if we don't talk about it. But if we can talk about it before then, it would give me more confidence going into that discussion. Is that something you'd like me to schedule?
We have plan office hours, but I would expect that, yeah, we'd be expected to attend publicly and discuss it publicly, which probably isn't going to work.
We can just turn off the live stream. People haven't showed up the last few times, and it's just been me. So if we want to use that time slot, I'm good with that.
All right, cool. That works for me. I don't know how many others it works for though. Okay,